the evidence from history is the way ordinary people survive and even thrive through difficult times is larger households. It's the most significant thing that all of our structures in the world are too big to be sustainable, globalised, but our households are too small. Too few people on average living together. Now, whether that's a family or whether that's some recombinant household, that's how I'm absolutely confident will be the prime strategy by which people adapt to difficult times.
The title, or the working title to tonight, is Responses to the Predicament of Our Times, and we have an elder in David and Sue who have been working for at least 40 years on an energy transition from, I guess, a cultural energy blindness to an energy consciousness. And I don't think I'll introduce you any further than that, David, but I thought what would be a good place to start is permaculture's inception. Take us back to 1973. You're a young man. The 1974 oil crisis is a major shock to this total ascension, endless growth world. And paint the picture of how that influenced you and also Bill, and how permaculture came forth out of that moment.
Well, of course, I was a student studying environmental design when I met Bill Mollison in 1974. 2 years after the huge change of government in Australia with the election of the Whitlam government in 72 and the troops being withdrawn from Vietnam, coming from a family of political activists who are at the forefront of that, politics filled my childhood. But at that age of being 18 years of age, felt like the world was my oyster. When I look back and see that that was the first crisis affecting the affluent countries of the world, first economic recession triggered by the price of oil going from $5 to $40 a barrel as a result of politics in the Middle East. The shock to affluent countries was dampened in Australia because Australia had most of its own oil needs met here by our only giant field, Bass Strait. Something that I didn't know at the time, but the Limits to Growth report of 1972 was, of course, exploded in 73, 74, this huge debate about whether industrial modernity would be limited by both resource limits and the limits of what was called sinks, where you send all the pollution. And of course, all the modelling of that showed some sort of collapse in somewhere in the mid-21st century. And many of us took that oil crisis, even though it was political, it wasn't actually the limits of resources. But it turned out it actually was, because the United States, as the biggest producer in the world, had peaked in 1970, but no one really knew. When Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard and the power of the swing producer, that people don't even understand what that concept is, moved from the East Texas Railroad Corporation, which controlled the oil flow out of the world's largest, in the United States' largest oil field, to Saudi Arabia, and the development of the petrodollar, which enabled the whole world of continuous money printing, and the empire that we are a part of in Australia, being able to basically print dollars, and everyone had to buy dollars because you had to have dollars to buy oil. And of course, oil runs everything still today like it did then. So those ideas were incredibly influential. I can remember Bill Mollison having a visit from one of his ex-students who was very affluent. And he said, "What are you doing for the coming collapse?" And she said, "Well," very earnestly, "I've got all my diamonds in a Swiss bank." And Bill said, "Oh, I might give you a couple of cabbages for those if you're lucky." So, of course, these were the discussions at the time. And it's true that Mollison and I and lots of others thought we actually had enough faith in markets that once they understood the limits to growth, experience what happens, how essential oil is and its price sensitivity, that markets would have the intelligence to forward plan. I don't know how, but isn't that interesting that we had that faith in capitalism, that the market would start pricing everything up, not just oil, but copper, cement. All of these things would create this transition in the world to things like permaculture, to a conserver society. But that didn't happen. In a sense, the opposite happened with the Thatcherite Reaganite revolution that we got with the Hawke-Keating government coming to power in 83 with a sort of a green tinge and a human face, but it essentially ushered in this endless free money, creating imaginary wealth that we've been living in since then.
So let me hear you if I've got this right. So American resources peaked in around the 1970s, which then necessitated the petrodollar. We're now at this stage where the petrodollar is vulnerable, and what seems to be the next stage in the empire in its unfolding or collapsing, as most people consider it, but maybe just the next stage in its development, is like a state-based or empire-based piracy and what we saw in Venezuela and possibly what we're seeing now in Iran is this this piracy of like controlling resource, particularly energy flows. And of course, Iran has the upper hand at the moment and has really sort of like affronted the empire in many ways. But the flows, particularly in terms of holding back Chinese and Russian ascension, Chinese through manufacture, Russia through their energy.
Of course, there's so many moving parts in this. And of course, as my later immersion in peak oil starting in the mid-90s, I went back to all this work of limits to growth and had a decade tracking all this stuff. And I've sort of arrived now at a point that the more one knows, the more you don't know about what's happening. But I would reflect on one thing that in that early stages of that awareness about peak oil in the mid-90s, I came to the realisation of why Japan in East Asia and European countries as strong allies of the United States were so politically craven in the face of US policies. And what I realised was that the US effectively controlled the Straits of Malacca and the Persian Gulf, where the current climate is, and could poke the ant's nest at any stage and then have bad Iran cause Japanese and then later Chinese and the European economies to go into recession, if not depression. And so that ability to have that influence over the world without actually doing it themselves was also like if Nixon had gone to the American public in 1970 and said, look, we've peaked, there's plenty of oil left, but we're going to have to raise the price. Of course, he would have been thrown out. But when the nasty Saudis did it, it was just something that had to happen. It was actually necessary for that price to go up. So the Western oil companies could then start tapping the hard-to-get stuff in the deep ocean, so those cycles of when you look back and see, that's some of the underlying things. The issues now are, very much at late stage, but there's so many moving parts. This move to piracy is a sort of a normal part of that process. And of course, the United States can partly do it because it still is actually the resource superpower.
It still has the Navy.
Yes, but also its resources, are not so far behind the great resource-rich country of the world by far, which is Russia, even without all what was the Soviet Union and Kazakhstan. And just Russia itself is the greatest resource-rich. But if you wiped away most of the discretionary economy of America and returned to a spuds, beer and petrol economy, which is the way I like to characterise it, then there is so many resources in America to sustain a cut-down version of maybe a North American empire. But it's this, is it going to also be controlling resources elsewhere in the world that other countries are dependent on? And that has been a long pattern that it's been able to do, that it looks like it's losing that now.
Yeah. So let's move from, there's a little bit of geopolitical setting there, and I'm sure you and I could yarn in this way, but actually I think the majority of people have tuned in here or come here to get to be inspired and to talk possibilities, responses. But before we get to that, I just thought maybe you could paint a picture about what LNG and oil sinks that have been already damaged, the years for production to get back, what has already occurred, even in this sort of, this kind of BS ceasefire moment, which is probably just a rearmament moment for the US and Israel and Iran. But it doesn't seem very sincere. It's probably ground invasion time any minute now, and then potentially 5 to 10 years of boots on the ground, a long protracted war in Iran. And the more Israeli and US attacks on infrastructure in Iran, the more Iran can hit Gulf states. And so in terms of agricultural product that comes from Gulf states and that region, including Iran, I think Iran is like the 5th most wealthiest resource nation in the world. So in terms of like energy and agriculture and, petrochemical products, medicine, plastics, clothing, just about everything that constitutes modernity, a lot of that resource comes from that region. And so the more the sort of the escalation ladder, what we've seen over the last several weeks is Iran being hit and then responding, and it's just escalating and escalating. So the damage that's already been done, the damage that is likely to be done in a ground invasion, it's not just, it's certainly not Venezuela, and it's certainly not even Ukraine. It has a far greater reach.
I mean, there's the oil, of course, that there was in 1973 and 79, but what there wasn't back then was the liquefied natural gas. Of course, Australia started that with our own Northwest Shelf instead of it being used to industrialise Australia, which is why the Whitlam government was actually thrown out, because it was going to industrialise Australia with the gas from the Northwest. So we were the first country.
Bypass the bankers.
Yes. But instead, that was the corporations created those huge special ships that hold the gas at enormous pressure. These gigantic systems that allow gas to be moved where you don't have a pipeline. And of course, Qatar is the second or third biggest exporter, and its enormously complex systems. They're talking about 6 years to get those systems up and running from the damage that's been done so far.
Yeah.
So the other thing is that the oil storages in those places also are now full, so they have to shut in the oil wells. So that can cause damage to the oil wells and fields and involve a lot of restarting. Because fertiliser is basically enormously embodied energy, it's produced in places that are rich in resources. Like Germany has largely closed down its fertiliser industry as soon as it didn't have Russian gas anymore. Russia is a big producer of fertiliser. The Persian Gulf countries, of course, are big producers of fertiliser. Apparently 64% of Australia's urea comes from the Persian Gulf. So farmers here are actually, conventional farmers are going to be short of fertiliser. So the impact of the fertiliser, the gas and the oil on the rest of the world, really fuel, fertiliser, food, the three Fs are the big ones. So it's hard to know. In theory, when you look at the excess wealth in certainly the affluent world and really most of the world now, you know, if you close down the dog shampoo services and half the cafes, and well, if you look at the Australian economy, like 3/4 of it is unnecessary. So in that sense, there's this enormous capacity of the world economy to adjust to these radical impacts, far bigger than, you know, what might conventionally be if all the economy was for essential things. But on the other hand, of course, the whole financial system depends on that continuation. So the financial underpinning, because it's the virtual thing which can just flash and disappear, it's not like depleting resources or changing climate. I think that is the big one, which is threatened, of course, by all of these changes. So it seems that some large-scale sustained impacts are going to be probably well beyond what is being talked about in the media and by the politicians. Whether you then jump to, oh, that means the unravelling of things, that means there won't be food in moles and bullies, I don't think those scenarios actually are likely at all in Australia for various reasons, mainly because if the government actually exists as a government, there's two functions: defend the territory and feed the population. And if you're not doing that, you're not the government any longer. So they will ensure there is crap food, even if it looks like the Soviet food system, and even if you need your barcode on your forehead to get in there or whatever. You know, it's more the issue of what is the straitjacket you are having to climb into. So I think between these two extremes of, oh, there's just going to be a little upset and there'll be some bad things happen in poor countries and we'll go on and we'll have to tighten our belts a bit. That's sort of at one end, and then the other end, it's the world's going to end. It's hard for people not to flip between those.
I want to, in your future scenarios work from several, maybe a decade or more ago, you talk about how in the regional areas like this, services will be let go, but people will have more liberty, more freedom, and therefore will need to develop networks around food and medicine and energy and sharing, and gift economy becomes very and barter and basically looking out for one another. And then those who really I guess not don't have that sort of constitution will flock to the cities where there will be potentially, much more authoritarianism over people's lives, but there will be access to industrial medicine and industrial food and energy, etc., or even in a sort of like digi food stamp sort of sense. But it makes me just reflect on the 3 Fs, because when I think of the 3 Fs, I think of flora, fauna, and fungi, and just how those three Fs are like so part of our ecological economy, and this sort of 20 years of detaching or creating an independent economy, independent of the global pool of money, the oil-based bankers' realm economy. But yeah, it seems to be like those of us who stay in the regions will have to accept less services, but will have access to healthier food, healthier biomes, healthier air, etc. Do you want to just speak to? I mean, that's a very simplistic. It's of course not going to fall to that fairy tale, but do you want to just sort of unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, I think increasingly what I suggested in the brown tech scenario, so that work is nearly almost 20 years in its origin, but in 2013 I said, looks like we're heading into the brown tech scenario where there's these crises that force governments to go, oh, we've got to do something. And they do big, hard, fast things, and they need the power of the corporations to actually implement them. Yeah. And then COVID was a sort of an excellent sort of implementation of that. And I can remember 20 years ago saying, we'll have a command economy. And people said, what's that? Well, I said, it's like the Soviet Union used to be. The government decides and forces this and that, and there's collateral damage, but they follow that big pathway of what they think's best. And then that creates situations where there's people bail out of that system because the constrictions of it are too gross. But they tend to be a minority, whereas most people climb into the tighter straitjacket, which you can characterise geographically, as you did, of being in the city, because the facilities, will be easier to maintain.
The ring of steel.
Yeah, well, so there's the greater control, but there's even the argument just in a practical sense that, well, one of the examples I used to give is if we are heading into a drier climate with increased bushfires, I'll close down the single line earth return power lines because they cause the bushfires, and the rate base is collapsing, land values going down, plough up the sealed roads. Look, you can sell your property for cents on the dollar to the government, your rural property, and move into retrofitted warehouses in Melbourne and Geelong. Yeah. And some go, no, I'm staying here. And then being more on your own. Or we can see this as like just a structural divide, for example, in the health system, that the health system is increasingly in crisis. And part of the logic in the health system is if people go and look after themselves, or at least those who want to look after themselves, like want to have babies at home, good, that's less load on the system. But another part is the system as an industrial system is saying we need X number of people through the doors to justify this system, so it wants everyone in the room. The supermarkets might be saying to government, yes, we can provide this, that and whatever, but our margins are so small, we can't afford for there to be 30% of a feral food economy of people feeding themselves through farmers markets. We need everyone in the room. So these tensions between the system saying, go and look after yourself and no, come back in, are structural. They're not just,
ideological,
evil, but they may be that too. And so that means that we're facing forks in the road where there's difficult choices, and we find ourselves more and more on one side of a chasm, and we have friends, family, and whatever on the other side. And how do we maintain connections and mutual support? Because if we think about that, if we think about, say, family that's either in the city or in some way in secure employment, but they don't have access to hunted rabbits or something else, or they have an all-electric house and they don't have any firewood. And we have that. But they have the ticket to get some access to the system that we don't have. So the synergies that could exist between people who are inside the system and those that are out. And I think that's one of the ways of dealing, with these difficult questions that come towards us, because I think a lot of them will happen in crises where you won't have much time, like people didn't with COVID, to am I in or out type of situation.
Yeah, it does feel like mandates, the rolling out of state top-down mandates are on the horizon, particularly if things worsen after this ceasefire. At some stage, 2020, I remember just being the sort of golden time where a lot of people I know were, including myself, were just like, oh my God, I can't hear a single truck, but I can hear so many birds. Wow, my whole nervous system is... And then, of course, people were strapped economically. However, there was a fair bit of social welfare going on. So I think fair to say many Australians, being a affluent country, liked the break, especially in the first parts of 2020. And then it all got pretty dark in 2021. But I just want to move to something that's a controversial subject, population. If we look at the bell curve or the curve of population growth since fossil fuels, it's basically like pretty stable for the last 2,000 years, and then fossil fuels, and then it goes like this. And now we have 8 billion people. If we go into a radically, with all this infrastructure that is getting... it's not just the years to rebuild this infrastructure. It's actually having the non-collapsed governments to have the money to rebuild it. And also all the time, this so-called...
And all the global supply chains of all the complexity.
Exactly, yeah. So when things, companies go broke, they may not necessarily start up again. And so global shipping is, already choked. And with more potential with the Houthis and other areas and other countries learning also from these choke points. Where can we cash in on this? Because Iran is actually doing quite well financially from this war at this stage.
And spot price for liquefied natural gas in Asia has doubled.
Yeah.
So that's going to be Australia's big earner for the time being.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. So there will be boom and bust. So I guess what I want to talk about though is some commentators are saying it's time to have children, because household and community economies are going to be super important. We've raised Woody to be a participant in the household and community economy, and now he's 13. He's working pretty much the same level as a young man in his, like a 19 or 20-year-old young man, and that's just because we've been living a kind of collapse scenario. 20 years behind you and Sue, of course, but this is 20 years of cultural transformation, and now Woody, who's out there with sitting around a fire with all the other kids, which is wonderful to hear their voices come in. But he, as beautifully, perfectly 13-year-old he is, and his playfulness in the mornings for 4 or 5 hours, he is a worker, and he understands the household economy. Now, in an aging population, apart from Israel, all the rich countries of the world have aging populations and not having any children. And part of that is that sort of liberal left idea of saving the planet by not having children. But I wonder whether to flip that, I wonder if actually having children is the most smartest thing we could possibly do right now. Knowing that there's also going to be probably population decline quite rapidly.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that have lined up, not just the very rapid ageing of populations and the drop in the birth rate, and a whole lot of disability that the limits to growth suggested with pollution in all its different forms that are affecting fertility and whatever, and then how many people are being raised, have been raised in the way Woody has, to be a useful, capable person that is useful to themselves and directly useful to other people, rather than trained to be able to put their ticket in a slot and get a job from some larger, complex structure, that without that structure, they're actually a useless person. And that's the tragedy of a lot of, modern, capable people of a whole lot of generations. So there's the issue of children as being part of powering up this larger scale household economy. And I think that's obviously, one of the big themes in retro suburbia, that the evidence from history is the way ordinary people survive and even thrive through difficult times is larger households. It's the most significant thing that all of our structures in the world are too big to be sustainable, globalised, but our households are too small. Too few people on average living together. Now, whether that's a family or whether that's some recombinant household, that's how I'm absolutely confident will be the prime strategy by which people adapt to difficult times. Because the efficiency of cooking for 6 people rather than one is, everyone knows, those economies. Obviously,
even weeding the carrot patch. Like if there's 4 of us, it's done in 15 minutes. If it's one person, it's a job that just goes on and on and on, and then there's demoralization. And so, just knowing how that, having young volunteers here, having sons that are have been raised to with skills, that is something that's come out of permaculture adaptability and thinking about low energy future and returning to that ancestral low energy culture making.
And of course, we need to acknowledge that efforts to do that over the last 50 years have sometimes backfired on many people, who've, kids that have grown up and, in a sort of self-reliant household, and then going, oh, look,
there's so
mum
much.
and dad's friends did up a couple of terrace houses and they're now millionaires and we're battling the kangaroos. Well, stuff this. So that there is that issue of thinking long-term and working for things that don't come about immediately, but planting the trees for the future, all of those sorts of things. And then there's that problem of being too early about something and then being inoculated against a sound idea by too early or poor an adoption of something.
Well, it's interesting you say that, just to interrupt, because before this last big oil shock or resource shock, I should also say, suffering of people in the Middle East. It's not just about energy and we're removed from that. There are people, tens of thousands of people who are suffering, who are not in a peaceful environment like this, that are waiting, probably boots on the ground. But there's a lot of destructive energy in a region of the world that's a long way away from here. Woody is not that, as a 13-year-old boy in Australia, he's not that sort of needs to know everything, but he knows enough context that instead of several weeks ago where he was starting to really show teenage consumer mindset, his level of focus, like ours, he is in, like Meg and I are in terms of okay, this is the next level of seriousness. And so he's stepping into all the stuff that he's learned. It's come to fruition. Whereas if we were going to go on and on and on into affluent space, he would be one of those kids maybe that goes off and explores something in that sort of hyper-techno-civility world like endless growth and endless consumption, and not really understand how important the transition from consumer to producer is. But he is fundamentally a producer, and even though if it was just energy ascent, then I reckon like obviously it's a household, but he's honoured. He can go wherever he wants. He can grow into whatever he wants. But if the economic and social reality is actually we're converting to production now, household community production, then he is well primed.
Well, I would argue that for many of us, getting it wrong about energy descent didn't actually lead to a bad life.
Exactly.
While acknowledging that some people pushed it hard and and it didn't work out. When we came to this community in 1985, it was like that was all over. People were moving back to the city, and of course that is 2 years after the deregulation of the banks and the Thatcherite Reaganite revolution. I've always said that if Permaculture 1 was launched into the world in 1983 or 85, would have sunk like a lead balloon. That, there was definitely, this wave was over, and people's own experience of that, of course, wasn't in any way related to things I'm saying. Oh, that's when I broke up with my hubby, or we decided the kids needed to go to a better school rather than the Yobbo high school here, and, different things that shape people's lives. But you actually, when you see those, they actually often fall into a larger pattern of these big geopolitical, psychosocial pulses.
Yeah.
And, I think there is that, of course, when these things happen and when you're young and when you're ready to sort of power up, there's, of course, huge opportunities, huge things about being useful and capable. And I mean, that's one of the things I've said about energy descent. It's a boon for young people who can work physically, as well as older people who have skills and knowledge and ways in this. And there's so many positive opportunities, and of course that is partly from where we are speaking in the lucky country. And I think about, you could have a situation where people are queuing up for food, and out in rural Australia there's still the grass is being eaten down by too many deer, rabbits and kangaroos, and there's too much dense small trees in our forests, too much fuel, that there's so many abundances that are not even recognised or even able to be used. So rather than the idea of people out in the country raping the land for the last sticks of wood to keep themselves warm, or killing the dairy cows for some meat, I think it's those sort of scenarios, although they're possible, I think they're so few people actually find those things attractive, and people are more likely to want to sit and wait and be told by the government where they can be provided for, where they can be looked after. And we only need to look at the evacuation in bushfires of people fleeing from defensible places to do what the government says, rather than feeling empowered to do things. Yeah. And I think that's the reality, but that is also an opportunity not to be a separate survivalist, because I still think it's household dependency and nested in community dependency and nested in ambiguous sort of relationship to the larger systems, where we still have people we know and love who are more in those systems, and how do we navigate all of that complexity?
Yeah. Well, COVID was certainly a dress rehearsal in that respect. Now, David, you have a very expansive mind, and I would not call your mind reductive, but I'm going to ask you to be a little reductive. And if people here or further afield in virtual webland are just starting out, who've just sort of like come to this video and like, wow, I'm reading this in a similar way. I think the global hypertechnicity is potentially fragile, and that means a lot. That means a lot to the future, my future economic reality. What are 5 powerful things that you would suggest? You've already mentioned a few things, but what are your sort of top 5 priorities for households right now? Even if this is just a little shock and then we go back to some more years before the next shock, even if things stabilize, because you have talked about coming over, permaculture is really going to kick in, not if it sort of goes over the hill and it's a lifeboat scenario, not if it's going to go brown tech, and not if it's going to go green tech, but it's more like sort of what Michael Greer talks about. John Michael Greer is the long descent. So we're probably most likely over the apex, and it's coming down slow with sort of some severe shocks and then stabling and severe shocks. But overall, the trend, permaculture really kicks in your future scenarios work when it's a long descent, and so whether that be the next several decades, but I'm making I'm making a very complicated question out of trying to get you to be reductive.
I used to hate those things of what's exactly what people should do, and of course the answer in permaculture is always it depends on context and different people's context. In retro suburbia, we used a household form and location matrix of 2 tensions: the tension to consolidate where you know versus the opportunities to migrate somewhere new on one axis, and on the other axis the ability, desire to create one's own new reality, and versus a downsizing and disowning and becoming flexible and adaptable. And that then created 4 solution spaces: the mobile minimalists, the communal collective empowerment, the classic retro suburban one, which we call Family Castle, with a nod to the Australian, great Australian iconic film, and the aging with grace, the downsizing in situ, and that creates 4 different possible solution spaces that are relevant to different people, partly according to stage of life and partly because of their own situation. So being able to have a discussion with a partner in one's family or household to be able to have some distance and try and audit one's situation, whether it's a sort of a simple SWOT analysis, used in business, strengths, weaknesses, threats and opportunities, tools like the retro suburbia real estate checklist, because people often say, oh, this place has been a great place to live for decades, it'll be fine in the future. Completely complacent. Or the other extreme of, I can't do anything here, we can't do anything here until we move to A, B or C.
Yeah.
And that usually a place is not like that. It's got all sorts of possibilities, and that's apart from how we change ourselves. So I think those audit processes, those discussions, not judgments about stuff harsh of I've got to persuade you to do what I think is right. How do you find that common purpose and things then that are achievable that at least have some, no regrets aspects rather than grand, huge decisions. But, for some people, the empowerment of learning a new skill can be, of actually becoming a useful person in that sense of I have something that I can do, or rethinking about the skills you already have. How could these skills work outside the monetary economy? How could they move and transform if that employment's not being there? And the big one, of course, is debt. Debt has this huge driver, which in most of these scenarios, just the near-term discussion of rising interest rates, property prices going down, huge vulnerabilities in terms of debt, and whether those big difficult decisions about downsizing to get out of debt, depending on what that is, might be like, oh no, there's this really big one we need to look at. But sometimes it's for a young person feeling disempowered, the fact that they got a knife and carved and made a wooden spoon, is sort of like the start of a self-empowerment process.
Well, Meg, when we have tours here, regularly speaks, if I could speak to that, says when I started this journey, I had no skills. I could fill out spreadsheets and work in an office and edit stuff online, but I actually had no practical skills, and that's incredibly empowering because people come here to see Meg's skills as well as mine and Woody's, and so just that incremental step by step is an empowering story. De-debting. So what I'm hearing is, looking at one's finances and seeing how the affluent in an affluent society. Rather than being caught by government-pressured austerity, which is usually brutal, how does one fabricate creative frugality, where frugality is actually joyous and creative and liberating, rather than imposed upon austerity. And household auditing, I'm hearing that's a really important thing we went through. Like for us, it was like, wow, we could get rid of 50% of our monetary needs if we went car free. So we sold one car, we had two when we got together, and then parked the other one in the carport, which is now a workshop, one of Woody's main education spaces, and with a logbook, and sat it there for a year, and we used it half a dozen times, and we were then after that saying we could go car free. So, and then with that 50% of our household income we didn't have to find, I could then stay at home full time and enact the food and energy economy just in 3 to 4 hours a day, and then have the afternoons to do cultural stuff, creative stuff, raise, homeschool, all that sort of stuff. So the initial 2 to 3 years were very hard. And we were quite purist in that time, because we had to defend this possibility from everything else in the dominant culture that just wanted to keep sort of breaking us apart. But then now that it's got its legs, we don't have to be purist, and purists are boring anyway. And I look at my furthest, I might be boring now too. I'm hoping I'm not boring you all. Yeah, let's just move to, before we open it up for questions, just to reflect, it's permaculture. And of course, there's so many other ways of relating to this time. I call it connecting to ancestral, land-bonded, low cosmology or life ways. But of course, permaculture encapsulates, with its principles, with its ethics, it encapsulates so much of that. But you can call it reclaiming one's indigenous soul. You could call it a kind of spiritual frugalism or creative hedonism or frugal hedonism, as Annie Fraser Rowlands called it. But I wonder if we could just end this part of the conversation before we open it up with the possibilities for cultural and spiritual renewal in a energy low or in an energy descending future.
Before that, Patrick, I wanted to mention another couple of examples of that retrofitting of one's own skills. And if you look at something like the building industry, it seems to me that in a lot of scenarios, once property values start going down, new building will just basically stop. The banks won't lend for it. What are people with skills in building going to be doing? Well, I think the great opportunities for individuals and small businesses is retrofitting existing buildings for larger households, and that will suit people who've got those skills to do, just this job here, maybe working with an owner. So there's example of that retrofitting of an existing skill set rather than saying, my skill is now finished, that my industry is dying. And I think the opportunities in the salvage economies that our son Oliver has been engaged in, like the fact that photovoltaic panels are being taken off roofs and just thrown away for scrap metal value, that are all completely useful, but it's outside the regulatory system, and it involves obviously skill and knowledge how to use those and connect those up. But so we've got a salvage economy opportunities that has never existed in history before, on a scale which is mind-boggling of what will become available. Just think of all the shipping containers in the world. What are they all going to be used for? Well, luckily we have a whole sort of shipping container sort of readaptation and building sort of culture already a bit in place. Yeah. So I think those are great examples of opportunities to pivot to other things.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you mentioned the salvaging. But
in terms of your question about the cultural renewal, I think with the work that you and Meg have done, and just so many of us who have a working relationship with nature, the appreciation of the cycle of the seasons, of the first strawberries that come in, of all of the life and death processes, and the fact that we're not in control, that the cockatoos have taken all my chestnuts and I just have to deal with it, all of those relationships are sort of building, I think, a spiritual connection and humility. And then again, at the community level, the same thing of dealing with neighbours in walkable community, that many of us, even that have been on this path, are still live in this hypermobility networked world between like-minded people. We'll find ourselves more having to deal with people with quite different understandings of the world, and how to make those connections in ways that are not judgmental, that are useful, being useful to another person who just sees things very, very differently. And, we already know that in our sort of communities and networks, and whether it's about anything, not just belief in climate change or vaccination or whether the Earth's flat or not. It doesn't really matter in so many ways, that connection to people.
I think that's
building that.
Why Meg and I talk about this hill as an unintentional community. There's 30 neighbours on this hill, and all of us have come together around the goats doing the bushfire mitigation. And whether that's just chance encounters with neighbours and their kids, or neighbours on a walk together and then they're yarning or giving the goats a scratch and we're coming along with some fodder and then we get talking about things. And I found it incredibly, like the huge political diversity across, much greater than just the usual binary. But the political diversity that exists on this hill is all dissolved through a goat. Yeah. And that is incredibly empowering and a beautiful human thing. And I think the neighbourhood sphere, I know you've spoken about it, we always speak about it. Our neighbours are so essential, as much as the people close in the zones 1 and 2 that we're living with are going to be essential. Handing over Roberto Perez, when you came to the town hall 15 years ago, when you and Sue invited a Cuban permaculturalist to speak about the power of community. And at this time, Cuba is suffering again because of the manipulation of the oil wells. American manipulation this time, is not just Russian. And he said, he pretty much finished this wonderful, like Meg and I were just together, we were just dating, we're sitting in the town hall, and we basically walked out with the words in his ear, catch your own water, grow your own food, say hello to your neighbour. And that was just so powerful for us. And we've been doing that ever since. And every time a new neighbour comes in the street, it's over with a basket and an introduction. And there's a neighbour next door who is a local GP. He's renting there. And he said just recently, I don't really have anything to give in exchange except for antibiotics. Like, we'll be right. We got our antibiotics. So I think, maybe this is a good...
I think I'll just end with that thing that I've so often said around the doing things that are at the edge of regulations, legality, and to audiences, very large audiences, sponsored by councils with the mayor or the sustainability officer in the room, and someone getting up and saying, what am I allowed to do? And me answering, don't worry too much about the legal licence, it's the social licence you need. And that comes largely from neighbours because it's the complaints mechanism, of course. And sometimes the social licence is more complex and difficult to get than the legal licence, but it's really important.
Yeah.
And so navigating that social licence to do things is rekindling self-governing communities.
Yes, exactly.
Because that's what our forebears, even in earlier phases of industrial modernity, speaking to a man in his 70s when I was 20, talking about the interwar years in Sydney suburbs, and the local cop being a sort of community facilitator in the street, and giving punishment out to young boys that had done, and that a world that he described in those interwar years that was like really even me growing up in the post-war period had never seen. So that there's so many things that we can recover that are not...
Maybe not cops beating our children up. But I know what you mean.
That often, once those systems have ossified, they don't go back.
Yeah.
The corporations are not going to become local businesses.
No.
It's actually building the new economy and community in the shadow of the failing one. And that's a strong pattern everywhere, that large systems, and even in nature, ecosystems become locked into a structure, and it's something new that comes from the weedy fringes that actually does something different.
Thanks, David. Beautiful. Over to you, dear peeps. Anyone got a burning statement or question?
I've got a question. I guess I'm just thinking about how you believe perhaps rural property price will crash, but I also see that's where most of our food is grown. Will farmland hold value, or will all regional property crash in your...
Yes, I think it's likely that farmland, productive farmland especially, will relatively speaking maintain value, even if it is a decline because of bursting of larger scale macro structures. And I think at a smaller scale, the version of what's happening globally where the corporations are now going and buying up the big productive farmlands, the ports, the basic sort of stuff that physically does things like produce food. I think at a slightly smaller scale, we'll see that as well.
Not just the corporations, but philanthropists as well.
And then do you see like there will be a greater need for rural populations to work that land with less abundant fossil fuel, or will it be more large farms owned by the state?
I think, yes, that is one of the things in an energy constrained world. Obviously, 8 billion people on the planet represent an asset. But when we look at affluent modern Western societies, we can say there's huge impediments to employing people in a conventional sense within the sort of current structures. And the price of food would have to go up substantially to make viable a lot of very small labour intensive things. But I think those shifts and the development of those small local economies could happen, but they also could be subject to being seen as discretionary expenditure. You know, the expenditure of organic food, the farmers market could be seen by people as discretionary expenditure. So I expect on the larger scale with the big land, you've got it more going, still chasing the economies of scale. So a bifurcation may increasingly happen. And of course, where you sit, Danny, is sort of almost on an edge in our local community between part of our shire, which is on the big productive land, which is plugged into the global system and the control of water and resources, and a whole mosaic of bush and small farms in the east of the shire that don't suit those sort of systems. So I think we could see that sort of bifurcation within our local community, like at a larger scale, that we're seeing places like the Ukraine as a food bowl that's sought after by the larger scale systems. We know in the old Yugoslavia, even though it was not strictly aligned with the Soviet Union, it followed a lot of the big industrialisation, and parts of Croatia and other areas with big flat farmland went that way, whereas places like Slovenia that were inherently small patches of valleys actually retained a lot of the traditional small mixed farming structure. So there's that strong influence of the nature of land as well as the economics.
And that sort of ties into with the question about to have children or not to have children, particularly for younger generations, because I'm just listening to the glorious sounds of those kids out there around the fire. I'm really glad that Kathy's rooster is guarding the elderflower cider in the cellar. So anyone else for a question? Yeah, Jordan.
Got a question. I just wondered on like both of your thoughts around what like the government's response at the moment, because it seems like we're all talking and thinking potentially it's going to be a longer conflict and perhaps fuel prices stay or increase even further. But there hasn't been any like rationing or anything yet. The government's just like, it's all fine, like carry on, maybe drive a bit less. It just seems like, do you think they're assuming that this is just going to blow over and we'll get back to normal soon? Because I don't know, it seems like it's a different reality to what we're seeing in the news. And
Thank you for that. That's a great question, Jordan. So Jordan is asking the government response, which I haven't actually been paying attention to on purpose, just because every time I hear the ABC radio and a politician speaking, I feel like I want to go and die. But so, and I'm also, unlike COVID, where I got very sort of, even though mine was a counter narrative, I was still captured. I was captured in the counter narratives. So, and I think what I suspect is happening at the moment is the typical paternalistic way of doing governance in Australia, where firstly paint the picture like this is a democracy, and the banks don't really own us and are not really puppeteering us, and big finance we're not subordinate to big finance, which, so they're promulgating the myth that they're somehow in control. We would have, I'm not someone welded to industrialization at all. I'm really trying to wind that back. The last 20 years has been a project of that. But if you have a look at how Australia's industrial base or industrial assets have just been stripped back and wound back, it's not because of people like, Whitlam was removed probably by the bankers' realm. And so big finance is what everything is subordinate to. And so governments are going to be basic, and I'm not saying governments are in on that at all. Governments, I think, are predominantly pretty clueless into what's going on. The fact that we've got a massive CIA base in the desert of Australia that no Australians, including the Prime Minister, can actually enter is a pretty telling sign of who actually is pulling the strings. So I don't think Australian politicians, while they will project the illusion of power, I don't actually think they're in control. All they will do is, as David said, food and protection. And part of that protection is creating a welfare state, which will then bankrupt the country further, and then throw us into greater austerity for our children and grandchildren's age. Greece is a classic example of a modern state that's happened to in a really bad way. And all the Western countries are going that way. So we're heading towards austerity, but like the COVID response is just billions and billions and billions and floating masses of petrochemical masks and needles and, no kind of awareness that this could have been a microbiome response, but no, we have an industrial one-size-fits-all response, and we will just make sure everyone's covered, everyone's got access to money, everyone's got access to meds, and we will control that, and we will be seen as heroes. I think they're just sort of anyway. That's my sort of cynical take on it. David, you probably have a positive take on it.
Well, yeah, it's hard to know. The normal thing would be to say they don't want to scare the horses because they don't want to crash the economy through people stopping spending. That the consumption economy is, Australia's basically got to dig it out of the ground, an exported economy and a consumption economy, which includes just building houses that are not necessarily used but keep rising in value. So that incentive to not tell people, it's going to be too bad, I think is fairly strong. Now, a counter explanation of that is, but in COVID, they did the opposite. They did this huge shutdown of the economy. And I think one of the explanations for that was that the financial system was in 2019 about to implode, and that they had to put this gigantic amount of fabricated money into the system on a scale far bigger than the global financial crisis. And that to avoid hyperinflation, they also needed to then constrict a whole lot of activity in the economy, which the lockdowns actually did. And that then the inflation that came was more moderated and constrained rather than turning into hyperinflation. Now, whether that's a sort of, that there are differences that we are facing by some measures, the classic stagflation, where you get inflation, but the economy is actually contracting because you've pulled real energy out of the economy, the underlying, or made it way more expensive.
Yeah, so that's stagflation is the, am I right to think that that's low jobs decreasing while inflation increasing?
Yeah, whereas normally, inflation is a characteristic of a rapidly growing economy, and at least you've got lots of jobs.
Yeah.
And that is said to be the central banker's worst nightmare, stagflation. So those possibilities, I think, are maybe a lot more severe than they're saying. The other thing that I think is important is to distinguish in terms of fuel availability, diesel. Because diesel runs the country, runs mining, agriculture, long distance transport, the military, and most of the essential services. And that's the thing that even before this crisis was the thing in least supply in the world. We'd reached peak diesel quite a long time ago. And so if you do have a rationing economy where you feed all of those eligible systems their needs, then the amount of diesel left over for ordinary consumers and non-essential economy crashes possibly to nothing. But petrol, which is not so much used for the essential economy, may be relatively more available. Or that in a rationing system, you might actually get some. But if you're not a farmer or a trucker or the mining industry, you won't get any diesel. That's it. So I think that dynamic is not being talked about. And of course, we've now got another little factor that our one of two refineries that we still have has just had a fire, and it's the petrol, which is Victoria's petrol, which might be affected. But, so there's all sorts of, possible scenarios, but I think generally they would be trying not to scare the horses too much.
Definitely. But also, disaster capitalism, I think, just gets more and more refined as behavioural units, which is now highly sophisticated science of how to work with governments to shepherd people into a cohesive path. And we saw behavioural units working with governments throughout COVID to make sure that everyone complied and pretty much everyone was on track. And so if you think of at this early stage of this unfolding catastrophe or this unfolding disaster, it may be some playbook, it may be some sort of next level of great wealth transfer if you think conspiratorially, or it might be just adapting to a disaster until a government or a set of governments, Western governments, seem to be sort of on par, maybe Instagramming each other all the time about, cohesive, single statement, unified, simple narrative to follow. This is all being constantly constructed, whether it be advertisements thrusted at us, or whether it be actually bigger crises. So it will also seem very random, like it was in 2020, and then by 2021 it was very clear, and it was either you are a granny killer or you're a good person. And so I think we'll see that same thing. And I'm my future projection is that you're either wanting to save the climate or you're a bad person. And so I think what the nudge units or the behavioral science units may well do, and this is my conspiratorial brain sort of working overtime, is sort of like allow this sort of disaster to unfold, allow the suffering narrative to unfold, and then a cohesive one-way only path that we'll all have to follow and we'll all have to go through the hoops in order to be a good citizen. And I can see that, and climate makes sense because all of a sudden if there has to be austerity, there has to be carbon, and in many respects it's like, this is what I've been waiting for all my life, but I have a major sus bubble around that because of who is controlling that narrative. And when I saw the Rockefellers move from petrochemicals into green tech all those years ago, that was when that first sort of sus bubble went off. It was like, oh, there's questions. So rather than having a solar system, solar, like a 1 kilowatt solar system on our house, which is a methadone program for coming off oil, we now have like 10 times those. We're encouraged to have 10 times those. So everything, it needs to be green and electric, and we can just keep mining and mining and mining. And so while we're burning all the brown material as we can, we're also aggregating the whole mining and extraction, like doubling it in green tech. And so my sus bubbles, once the Rockefellers went into that space, it was like, I don't trust this space anymore.
So I would agree, Patrick, and I sort of outlined that in my climate essays to some extent, and that, COVID could be a dress rehearsal for climate emergency and good and bad people. But I think that story and the potency of that story has been fading for quite a long while. And in a way, war is the old one that governments have always used to deal with the issue of internal structural problems of financial systems that inevitably have to break, of internal corruption and dysfunction and resource depletion and non-negotiable environmental changes that you can't wave a wand and make go away. But to especially the financial things that, sorry, this is whole house of cards, and we're going to reach back into the system and grab the actual things that are still worth something, and suddenly everyone else, as Nicole Foss said, misses out on a chair in the game of musical chairs, that there isn't, none of this wealth actually existed. So the enemy, the old psychology of the bad enemy is you could say the last resort, and has historically been that. So whatever the case, there's many possibilities, obviously, of the aliens arriving and tell us we've all been bad. And I think my appeal in permaculture networks is whatever the next great crisis that comes suddenly, and there's this requirement to all align because of A, B, and C, everyone must do X, Y, and Z, to recognise that while flocking together for mutual protection is a survival strategy of social animals, there's also the scatter strategy of do different things. And that can, at least those who decide that yes, flocking is essential, that they can accept that some of us are going to scatter. And so that appeal rather than that internal demonisation, because the other way historically to think about these processes is it's not large-scale geopolitical conflict. That is actually an outcome of internal society conflict and this idea of elites attacking each other internally fighting over a shrinking cake, and that cascades down through society to collapse societies, and that then those internal conflict processes, which at the extreme are civil war, manifest themselves in external relationships. So that you can think of Israel, the United States and Iran as the three primary players maybe in this current war in the Middle East, are all countries completely riven by all sorts of internal conflicts and tensions that have been developing over a long period of time. And of course, the United States, based on Israel's advice, was so confident about that internal conflict in Iran that they thought it would all just fall apart. But it tends to actually do the opposite, of course.
Yeah.
But those processes, those tensions and conflicts there, how to insulate ourselves from those cascading down into communities, I think is the most important.
I think that's important. Also, something you said a little while back, which I interpret as the problem of othering, because that's what propaganda does. It gets a cohesive story and gets the majority to try to believe in it, but then there's always going to be the difference of there's always going to be people who think differently and independently, and I guess the awareness of not getting caught up in whether bigger narratives or counter narratives is something I'm really focused on at the moment. Going into this, that may be hard to do, but I think, like, in terms of the possibility for spiritual renewal, moving from, as we've discussed, consumer to producer cosmologies, earth honouring, sacred feminine. I wonder whether we could maybe finish by a question from maybe one of our women folk in the room. Veronica.
Yeah, you've brought up some good points, and Matt and I were discussing about COVID and the division. You know, it's that old saying, the divide and conquer. And thought popped into my head, so what's going to be the division with this next scenario? And yeah, it could be the climate change, or it could be a matter of survival, where people are that desperate that they do things they wouldn't normally do to survive. So how can we prepare ourselves and prepare the community so that we don't have this division like we did, what we saw in COVID? And yes, it was like a dress rehearsal for something that's probably going to be even longer than normal COVID.
I think that would characterise as that scatter inevitably involves diversity, lots of different things, whereas the flocking by its nature involves around some solution that by the mass of it is a solution, which does create that huge tension. And COVID was exactly that, because it was said like, oh, everyone needs to, for the good of the whole type of idea, rather than, oh yeah, it's fine. Wouldn't it be good to have control groups or experiments, or to see different things in a novel, uncertain situation? I think the most likely thing is, how do we run a rationing economy with modern digital technology, and some version of, whether it's central bank digital currency, what is really called more generally programmable money, is just so obviously logical to bring in some form where, instead of, like happened in the Second World War, a huge number of bureaucrats all, operating the rationing system, and the society as a whole agreeing that this was necessary for the common good, that you have less certainty and commonality about whether it's necessary, because there's 1,000 different voices all saying different things, and the differences that are already in society. and the incredible attraction of having the ability to, yes, you can buy exactly that product or fuel, today, and you have this number of credit points, and, but no, you can't. That it's so logical that this would be the stepping stone into that. And I think what that illustrates is this thing of where it may be functional and only practicable for, like, between partners, say, for example, of one person is in the system and got some, like a bank account in whatever the new bank accounts are, and the other partner doesn't. They're outside of that. And we can think of that as the household community non-formal economy, that it will make functional sense to be able to span across those systems rather than either being all in or all out, even though that will happen too. But if we want to avoid the journey to what some might characterise the Desi Freeman sort of story, whatever is true about any of that story, we are going to be in this ambiguous relationship with the system through some means. And so I think that's also relates to that, not demonising actually interdependence that actually breeds, I need what you're doing over there and you need what I'm doing. So I think that's one.
I could imagine going over to my neighbour Bob and say, "Hey Bob, can I borrow your green tick? I've just got to go over to the metro and get a bit of petrol for the chainsaw." Nikki.
My question is really to both of you, and I guess it's been great to get a sort of a big picture, and I kind of, where I'm moving to is a bit like, where do we go now? And I guess I'm thinking about, when I think about our sort of core needs of food, shelter, community, energy, and certainly we know through COVID, and I think we're seeing in this situation now that, long supply chains are absolutely not working, and they're dominated by the big corporations. So I suppose it's like, what do you think are the really critical things we need to be putting in place at a local level, and what are some of the fundamental principles that we need to be incorporating into that, so we can have good quality food, we can be protecting our water, we can have energy that is sustainable, I don't like that word sustainable, but regenerative, safe roofs over our head and a sense of community. I know that's a big question, but I sort of feel like I want to be able to have a sense of where we take this, and where we can apply some of our energy.
Thanks for the question, Nikki. So Nikki's asking really questions around local economy in the face of long supply lines collapsing, or choke points in those supply lines. The obvious solution to that is relocalization, which I think is you're talking about. And so more specifically, you're saying what's the vulnerable, what's the missing things right now? Because I would say that we're still, like, even just talking, following on from David's digital incarceration aspect, I'm sort of thinking at some stage it'll be too dangerous to be welded to the internet. We know it comes from the US military. We know it's a massive surveillance tool and data collection tool. I'm thinking the greatest thing that will be necessary is information. And so I'm like, I remember when I started off at art school, I used to make these little artist books with a platen press, and I used to hand type stuff. It's like I'm thinking platen press or a Roneo or a photocopier or some sort of like older analog printing in order to create a local newspaper. And I'm, like, how do we, if like there's lots of scenarios that the internet will go down, Iran could potentially take out important infrastructure that runs the whole internet. The internet is high energy needs and consumption. AI is high energy. So, like its bubble is bursting because of that. But also maybe the internet may go dark in an act of war or sabotage, or it could just be too dangerous to be on it in terms of like not wanting to just get suckered into quite an authoritarian way of life. So my thing is like, well, we will get quite isolated because we're so, like, I just think about all the different groups, chat groups, from sports groups to even a local responding to this predicament group that many of us in the room are on. But yeah, lots of different, like our whole networks within 10 to 15 years have been pretty much the way in which we receive information, even with the establishment media, is digital. And so, yeah, my thinking, well, I've been rebuilding my library, paper library. I've been enjoying books more, defragging and withdrawing from the internet as a practice, but also like what replaces it. So, and the local newspaper here, The Advocate, up until probably 10 years ago, was an incredibly important place for letters and letters of concern and keep people. I feel like completely, because of, the internet has made things so much bigger and wider and global, but I actually don't really know what's going on in the socio-political sphere of this area, except through relationships, like individual relationships, but there isn't a local paper anymore. So I think things like that. So publishing for me is a big one.
Yeah, that's in some ways, rather than information, I would say communication. Obviously the two are tied together there. And I think of thinking of all of these things as tools or strategies. There's not sort of one thing that's most important. There's some things that are near-term quick adaptions, and there's other things that are rebuild the capacity to actually print a local newspaper. But communication that is can work between computers that that is not via centrally controlled systems is, of course, I don't understand all that stuff, but there's other people that do. Similarly, I think transportation, most of us in especially these rural communities are very dependent on transport, not just for our own connections and work and psychological and community well-being, but also the supply lines of whether it's even, Sue's bulk food buying networks still depend on trucks coming, from northern New South Wales or, for rice, or even just from Burrum Biodynamics, out at on the Wimmera Plains. So these systems of the possibility of independent fuel, and the nearest term capacity for that is actually biodiesel made from waste veggie oil. The possibility of independent diesel substitute fuel for useful vehicles, important vehicles, like small trucks. I think that is quite a big priority. In terms of personal transport, there's obviously options around electric bikes and electric cars that are obviously going to, increase in use. But it's this, how do we actually move stuff? And if you can't get fuel because you don't have the ticket, what's your food co-op wants to, move something or go and buy something for distribution. So I think there are people who are focused on those things, and I think they're really important, because even those of us who are most self-reliant in food are still dependent on these systems. Now, if you look at that transport and you think of electric car, electric bike, immediately available, diesel truck with biodiesel, it's actually being made somewhere, and when that truck delivers, it actually picks up fuel. Maybe not at exactly the same person's place that they dropped the bulk food off at. Those possible things. And then you look at things like Oliver's wood gasification research for hybrid wood gas electric trucks, but that's in the prototype R&D development stage. So, there's only going to be a few tinkerers who can, at this stage, make that work. But if you look at those things, you can see in transport, there's some things that are immediate options, and some of them are literally just conventional consumption options. And then we look at all the behavioural things. If say, okay, how do you network so everything's backloaded, where people are ride sharing, and all of those behavioural changes, and obviously opportunities like working from home. So reducing that dependence, and then being able to also prioritise fuel to the chainsaw, the pump, those sort of like really important things for energy and water. At the same time as saying, an electric pump as well as the petrol pump. So there's lots of those things that you could say are all things that people in our community might become expert in.
But there's also a lot of fat in terms of the behavioural change. Like our family's a bit of an anathema, but as a family we hitchhike. Hitchhiking, when I grew up in the 80s, I was a teenager in country New South Wales, everyone hitchhiked. So, there's a huge amount of fat there. Then, like some of the stuff that I really yearn for, my whole being is to work more with animals. And, before I die, I would love to have a donkey, and I'd love to build a donkey's cart. So I think, yes, there's high tech, there's new tech like Ollie's work, which is sort of this hybrid, beautiful old new technology. Then there's the green tech scenario. Woody's just spent the last several years just selling bags of firewood and chopping boards, and he saved up $3,000 and just bought himself an electric bike. And now we've put my old trailer on the back, and he goes into the forest with this to collect firewood. So I think there's going to be, as David says, like a real big range of different technological in terms of transport, and probably in communications as well. Because even though we've forgotten so much so quickly, that's that sort of technology thing of amnesia, like mastery into the next technological rupture creates amnesia for a behind. But if forced, we draw back very quickly too. So I think there's going to be drawing a fair bit of drawing back, and that will just, I think, be dependent, and how quick that is how quick things collapse probably.
I think also, back with the favourite one for so many of us of food, that opportunity for those of us who are better as food producers and more focused, being able to pass on those skills, pass on seeds, sometimes pass on an old shovel or a fork to someone who's actually wanting to start and is really keen. And things obviously like seed saving, from the sort of high level plant breeders in our community through to the sort of simple things of the resilient perennial leeks, walking onions, potato varieties that just keep coming up in your garden and never get diseased. And they're less productive than maybe some others, but they're that sort of resilience distribution of those sorts of things, I think, to a wider selection of people that then feel empowered, that they at least are reducing the cost of possibly their fresh food bills, and it's something of sanity in a world going nuts, even if it's not going to be, feeding people their staple food supply or whatever. So extending that skill base we have and getting better at it, because I think those domestic skills, and whether it's the work that Meg's done with fermenting, and the number of people in this community that now ferment foods, and the people who know what mushrooms to collect, this.
And,
so
people like Katie, who and many others in the community that have herbal medicine knowledges, crazy people like myself who are learning to self-suture.
Well, that actually raises that the big weak
Yeah.
link, and I think that's what I suggested in Retro Suburbia, that the weakest link in the whole agenda we've certainly been pursuing over decades, I thought was health and fear of death. Of course, COVID sort of showed this is really the weak link. And I said in Retro Suburbia that the chapter on health, disability and ageing was the last chapter I wrote, partly because I didn't feel that it was my area of expertise, but it's so problematic, and it's so often the cause of people crashing back into 100% dependence on the system. So rather than sort of, this idea that we're all going to go cold turkey removed from that, but that's one of those big divides, and rebuilding those basic skills of for years Sue would use closures to close up injuries that most people would go to the doctor for stitches, but then you suturing your eyes, the next level of empowerment.
Yeah, one of the things that we really emphasise when people come here on a house and garden tour is the three capitalisms that people can attend to immediately in their lives. That we talk about private property and the problem of that. The colonial structures of that are so intense and deep that that's a longer term generational, intergenerational societal challenge. But the capitalisms of food, medicine and energy are things that people can be re-empowered with in a very short period of time. But I think medicine is the thing that, as you say, welds people into the system. And the problem with industrial medicine is that while it treats one thing, it causes all these other problems. So it creates this cycling of dependency because it doesn't actually, the great majority of medicines don't actually bring health. They bring profit.
Of course, in a positive version of Energy Descent that I wrote 10 years ago, History from the Future, about this region going through the changes. One of the positive stories was that the Dalesford Hospital became a centre of this rebirth of conventional medicine scaling down for Energy Descent, of doctors who are aware of these issues with the alternative and complementary health base that exists in this community, and that's developed a cell of sort of localized medicine, which was a fusion of these things. So I think storytelling is also important in sort of trying out things and ways of thinking about
and even with this tonight, inviting a number of you from across different parts of the community to the house, not a massive event, and hopefully we'll be invited to other events too, where people hold these sort of like sharing and I guess community brain dumping times to generate thought so that we're not isolated. And I would be keen to just take one more question if there before we wrap it up, and then maybe we can have some more conversation over some stewed quince or something like that. Nick.
This is maybe a question of like urgency, but is it, and I might frame it as a personal question, but I think is relatable. I've been working a normal job, and then I put the head torch on at home and do permaculture in the evening. Is it time to like finish that, like quit that job and focus solely on the home economy as a matter of more urgency, or is there more time to transition?
Really good question. Yes, timing of things is very, very difficult to say. And obviously Mollison and myself in later decades could be accused of being the boy who cried wolf about, I thought the 87 stock market crash, had to be the collapse because just the insanity of the financial systems in the world, the GFC in 2008. So of course the point about the boy who cried wolf story is that wolf eventually came, and people didn't take any notice. But I think there's also each context, each personal and family situation is very different. Like a situation of debt, and thinking about it thoroughly, that debt was the major vulnerability of losing property that you're committed to, can mean that for some people, yes, maximising the opportunity to earn money while that is working okay, while that is actually really producing significant return savings that are being put towards debt. But if that's not there, and there's all sorts of vulnerabilities that are looking like lining up where that time spent working will become more problematic, either the work won't be there or the travel to it will be more problematic, then, and there's a whole bunch of things that you've got on the go implementing that need sort of full-time multitasking attention of being on site, because you've got so many things on the go, that the value of those all coming to fruition is like really important to have that 100% focus. So you could see how that would create, very different situations for people in different positions. And I can see you thinking about that, knowing that you've got a lot of property development stuff that you've implemented and are working on, and that you could be really fruitfully using your full time on that. Whereas some other people might find they're rushing around without knowing what to do, or because they don't have a whole framework and all the skills and capacities to sort of implement all those things, and they may make a lot of mistakes, that trying to do too many things all at once, or not sort of thought through, or so a lot of it's about resources and capacity and net gains, and what are those. But I don't think there's but I think this is certainly a time where you could say, yes, let's take time and make that a focus. But it's still good to say, okay, are those things I want to do anyway, that they're not driven out of a situation of fear, or just oh, we need to do this. I'm reluctant to do it, but we have to do it. It's where, no, this is what we want to do.
Yeah, that's for me. That was where I would answer it. Is like what's in you, what's alive in you, and what's your intuition saying. Because there's the hard sort of left brain part that has to service the debt, or be the main breadwinner at the moment. And then there's the other side, the mythos, the gut, the intuition. And just, I guess, how those things, the practical and the intuitive, the practical and the sacred, how are they speaking to each other? Yeah. And then I think through that, if there's a conversation with all parts of yourself, then you'll know what to do. Yeah. And keeping an ear out, keeping an eye out, asking questions and seeing what other people are doing. I sort of feel like that's the human experience is like, yeah, not just jumping into fear. I know when this started, it was like, I've got to build a front fence and get a guard dog. And so that was highly reactionary. And then, so I took that back and I put the fence that I was building as a berry frame. And now I'm building the fence. But not out of fear, out of response. And it's not going to be such a big fence. It's just I'm building a fence. A nice little picket fence, because I got a whole lot of pickets from the sawmill salvaged the other day. Yeah, so I think noticing myself...
You're not creating white picket fence.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
Oh dear.
John Howard's a political hero of mine. Thanks, Matt. I'm getting the wind up from Meg. Thank you. Thank you so much, David, for offering your wonderful brain and extensive way and thinking ever since you were a young man. There's young people in this room today that I think will carry this night and your wisdom forward with them, just as you have with us. And people like Roberto Perez has really landed, and he's an elder in his community now. He was a young man when he visited, as I was. So, yeah, thank you for your endless generosity and wisdom and care for the planet and the people in it.
And thanks to you and Meg for hosting this and a million other things that you guys do in this community to bring all these skills and possibilities to life. Yeah, thank you.